It was the advent of the second plane, sharking in low over the Statue of Liberty, that was the defining moment. Until then, America thought she was witnessing nothing more serious than the worst aviation disaster in history. Now she had a sense of the fantastic vehemence ranged against her. I have never seen a generically familiar object so transformed by effect. That second plane looked eagerly alive and galvanized with malice and wholly alien. For those thousands in the South Tower, the second plane meant the end of everything. For us, its glint was the world flash of a coming future. Terrorism is a political communication by other means. The message of September 11th ran as follows: America, it is time you learned how implacably you are hated. United Airlines Flight 175 was an intercontinental ballistic missile aimed at her innocence. That innocence, it was here being claimed, was a luxurious and anachronistic delusion. Hello everybody and welcome back to Tales from the Quill, and this is episode 5. And those words were written by the late great Martin Amis, who is the topic of our show today, and I'm joined by the wonderful booktuber Will Chambers to talk about the life and works of Martin Amis. Sit back, relax and enjoy. Hi, Will. Thank you so much for joining me. I'm really pleased you were able to find the time to do this.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to see you and speak to you.
So we're going to talk about Martin Amis, who sadly recently passed away.
Just because of part of my research, I will say properly, Sir Martin Amis. He was knighted recently, so he does have that as a slight posthumous award. I did it one day before his, I presume for technical reasons, one day before his demise.
That's right.
He was awarded a knighthood.
So, I read that as well, because I'm sure like it wasn't long before he died. I looked him up for some reason. I think it was because I was reading. I was rereading. Oh my goodness, Lucky Jim by his father, yes. And for some reason I clicked on and. I looked at him, and I'm sure he wasn't Sir Martin Amis. And then when I read, in preparation for this, they backdated it to a day before he died. Yeah, yes. So that's right. Yes, forgive me, Sir Martin Louis or Lewis. I don't know how he would have said it. Amos.
I imagine we'll get into this later, but I imagine from his point of view, he would pronounce it as Louis. I imagine just something more, slightly more. Just more to it that way. I think.
But then I suppose he could be Sir Martin Louis Ami. Instead of Amos. So anyway, Will, the first thing I'd like to know is how did you get to hear of Martin Amis? What's the history of your relationship to this interesting author?
I got into reading relatively later, serious reading, I would say, in my later teens, and I got the Rachel Papers was my first formal introduction to him, and I've spoken about this elsewhere, but I think it to be true. I think for some readers, there's like a glorified version of the first book that really gets you. And if it happens in your formative years, it's usually the story of an outsider. That seems to be the case with everything, whether if it's in America, I know the cliche one over there is, or not cliche, the popularized one is probably Catcher in the Rye or something along those lines. And for me, it was a mixture in the same sense of the Rachel Papers in 1984, so I had a full-on outsider in 1984, and then I had a weird maximalized literature style of Charles Highway being this teenager you would aspire to, but there were gritty elements to it as well. So it was a very strange and thrilling style to come across for one, because it was very. Even though it's from the 70s, I think it's 73, 74, I think its style maintained itself up until when I read it in the early 2000s. I was just taken by the character to begin with from there, and that was it. And I weirdly got an introduction to Amis via his partner in crime, Christopher Hitchens as well.
Yes, yes, good friends, great friends, those two. And it's funny you mention that because I probably sorry mentioned the time when you first read it back in the early 2000s was actually when I first read it as well. But I'm guessing I'm probably older than you, so I was already 20 when I read it because I read it in 2000. And I read it purely by chance. Actually, I was living in Germany, and I'd visited. I think it was the bookshop at Frankfurt Station. They had a tiny English section, and
Okay.
they had two books there that I thought I should read. And one was Catcher in the Rye, and the other was the Rachel Papers by Martin Amis. And I only uh, picked that one up because I had actually just read Lucky Jim for the first time by his
Mm.
dad, and it was kind of funny reading those two books together. But as much as I enjoyed it, I can't say that I became like a Martin Amis super fan.
No, I think in part of looking around, not just the Amis books I've got for information about Martin, and by extension, as you say, Kingsley Amis, which is we can touch on, which is a very looming shadow that you can't necessarily always escape. But yeah, I thought from reading around it, it is a very much, this might be a statement people globally listening to might not understand, a very Marmite situation. It
Mhm.
is very much a love or hate, or love, people don't love, people will admire the craft, because I don't think there are many people outside of, well, inside anybody who considers themselves well read would be able to read Martin Amis and say, technically, this is poor.
Mm.
I don't think there's very much examples of that in the entire body of Martin Amis's work.
Mhm.
But in terms of the actual, if you're not on board with this very glamorized, very much the epitome of 80s glamour,
Mhm.
as you
Mhm.
get with later books like Money and stuff like that, where there's just that theme of there's excess, there's just excess dialogue, excess adjectives, excessive verbs, everything, nothing can be described in a sentence. And one of my favorite quotes, which is what Kingsley gives, is after reading sections of one of Martin's book, he says, "You don't have enough sentences like," and they finished their drinks and left. That's the sentence as it should be, but instead Martin's aim is there'll be a paragraph instead of that one short line.
But I think that did really fit in, as you say, with the culture of the time. I mean, the
Yes.
'80s in I can't really speak for America, but it was that era of excess, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Thatcher's Britain, where everyone's out for themselves, kind of thing, and to make money, the whole yuppie culture and all that kind of
Yeah.
stuff. So I think, I mean, of course, I mean that's probably part of the reason, or one of the reasons Martin Amis wrote Money anyway. I guess,
Yeah.
given that the
I think it was probably that as well, plus the time he spent with Kingsley when Kingsley went to do lecturing in Princeton in America. I
Mhm.
think that was probably Martin's first eye opener into the American ideal of there's always aspiration upwards. There's always, it's just in the very much in the American culture, from my perspective anyway. That seems to
Mhm.
be the aspiration, is there's always the climb to the top, and that seems to be a point in a lot of Amos's literature where there is a climb out, but it usually starts much lower down. It usually deals with either the upper class or the working class or social
Mhm.
class,
Mhm.
or social working class moving up a notch or trying to get to the top, and usually in spectacular, spectacular failure.
Mm, yeah. So let's I don't know. Let's have a little look at Martin Amos's early life. We know he was born 73 years
Yeah,
ago, back in 1949 in Oxford, and of course his pedigree. Coming from uh, the I was going to say coming from the loins, but that's not really what is it. But coming from
it's not. It's not
uh,
wrong. It's not wrong. I think
that's not
Kingsley
wrong.
would admire that description. Yeah,
Coming from, of course, Kingsley Amis, who was a well thought of and beloved writer in his own right.
it's a very unique situation where I think outside of this situation of Kingsley and Martin, I don't think I think you probably find elsewhere in the world of sport where there is a lineage of belonging to a profession and excelling at it,
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
the apple never falls far from the tree, and growing out of that shadow of the same tree. But just the striking number of similarities between their lives as parallels are very. It would be, you wouldn't believe it if you were reading it in a book yourself. where Martin's born 4 years after the end of World War II. Kingsley's born 4 years after the end of World War One. Their first books received the Somerset Maugham Award. And while looking at this, I was looking around and I was thinking, I wonder who the contemporaries were of Martin for his first book by the time he gets to that. And there are other people around. So Vonnegut has a book in 73. Toni Morrison has a book in 73. But before you even consider who you're competing with in the year you initially first publish, Kingsley Amis has already published 11 novels by that point.
Mm-hmm.
And one of them is Lucky Jim. One of them the following year is shortlisted for the Booker Prize. So I don't know if I've ever interpreted it as being the maximalist nature of Martin's work is I have to do more than my father, and I have to do it better or more with more flash. I have to impress him. But obviously, as in the example before, where he says you don't have enough simple sentences, or in the example of is it The Information or London Fields, where Martin Amis puts himself in it as a character, and his own character's introduction into the book. He chronicles as Kingsley just at that point just threw the book across the room, and I'm not reading. You're buggering about with the reader is how I describe it. But
and of course, another parallel is sadly they die at the same age.
Yes,
as well. They were both 73. So
and there's just weird similarities or an inability to escape the life of Kingsley. In that Kingsley had his own touches with Marxism, stroke communism, his own political movements moved back and forth very oddly. And then obviously Amis's best friend and partner in crime, as we said, the bête noirs, as you want to call them, or whatever they are, him and Christopher Hitchens. Christopher Hitchens was a Marxist / Trotskyist, so even though Martin didn't do that, he's surrounded with motifs of his father's life, seemingly constantly throughout his life. So yeah, it's a very, very interesting upbringing. And I can't imagine it's a boring upbringing either because of literary parties, literary events. You could easily have a friend of your father come round to the house, and it's Philip Larkin, for example. So it's not. Again, it's just that world of celebrity must be a unique experience literarily.
Yeah, because I think Philip Larkin composed a poem inspired by the birth of his sister. Martin Amis's sister. So I mean that's really cool. And I mean, it doesn't have to, of course, even be a friend of his father, because when he's 12, his parents divorce or split up. I don't know if they did they divorce. Yeah, they divorce.
They divorced, and then his father with a very much a womanizer. Like there is no upside to Kingsley's relationship status with anybody. He seemed to be very much in it for himself and gratification wherever he could find it. But for a time, it was he was partnered with Elizabeth Jane Howard, who in herself is a very famous writer.
Exactly.
So I've personally only read the Cazalet Chronicles by Elizabeth Jane Howard, but again, I can see where that influence on Martin's life was very impactful, because she pointed him towards the point of view of saying, you're being a bit of a wastrel, you're just wasting your time. You're not putting any effort into this gift you've got because you're clearly bright and intelligent, and gave him his first nudge towards people like Jane Austen, which is strange considering you've got Kingsley Amis as a father. You'd think if there was any literary influence, it would come that direction. But then I suppose that the rebelliousness of being a teen is you wouldn't want anything to do with whatever your father would think was cool or interesting.
Well, I think Kingsley even complains at some point that his son, up to like his mid-teenage years, is just reading science fiction nonsense, that kind of stuff, which he doesn't have much time. Well, his words, not mine, because I know a lot of people who listen to this do love science fiction. But
it's interesting because it's kind of also how Martin cut his teeth, for want of a better words, in the when he was at the New Statesman and beforehand when he was working for literary supplementation and stuff like that. He was doing reviews of science fiction or hard sci-fi and stuff like that. But then that always intrigued me that Kingsley would frown upon that, given Kingsley's. Again, as you say, I'm not disrespecting an area or a genre of whatever it is, but Kingsley did genre fiction for himself as a writer who contributed under an alias for James Bond novels and stories. So it's odd that there would be that type of an almost look down or a sneering upon a category when it's not.
Hence the alias, probably.
Yeah. Hence the alias, probably, but not. Yeah, so it's kind of a people in glass houses shouldn't throw stones situation there very much.
Yeah, yeah. But his parents, as we say, divorce. He spends a bit of time in Spain, and of course, he goes to, is it Menorca or Mallorca? Mallorca, I think,
Yeah,
and with his mum and I guess
yeah,
his sister, and they stay with none other than Robert Graves,
yeah.
which is again a fantastic and really remarkable literary figure to be hanging out with.
Indeed. And I haven't personally got much experience with Robert Graves. I've tried to read I Claudius.
Oh,
I know there's a whole series there, and I imagine other people could probably speak better to Robert Graves. But yeah, there seems to be an inescapability from the world of the literati in some
mm.
form or another. It just seems to you can't get away from it.
No, no, definitely not. So, yeah, I don't know much more about his early life and his childhood. I mean, obviously, he went to schools and things, didn't he?
He did. He was when I was reading into it. He wasn't a very promising student from accounts that were given. However, one of the things I'm going to forget the author's name if I have it as a reference. There is a author, a crime writer, who took issue with him, which is I'm not going to be able to find it now. Oh, sorry, Peter James. So
Hmm.
yeah, at some point, the promise of Martin Amis as a student got to a point where he was able to go to an Oxford Crammer, as it's
Uh-huh.
called, in order to say this is your way in. If you can get the results here, you can do it. And apparently, at some later in life literary event, the author Peter James bumps into Martin and says, "Martin, it's me, Peter James. We were at the same Oxford Crammer to try and get in." And I don't know why, but just cuttingly, Martin, the quote as it goes is, "No, I don't remember you, and you only remember me because I'm famous." So, off the cuff there, not the most warm and welcoming type of response you'd
Well,
get from somebody you were at school with. But I think that plays into the character of Martin as a character, which I imagine is probably a defensive mechanism whereby if constant pressure is put on you as, well, you're the son of Kingsley Amis, greatness must just happen. You'd almost
well,
have
I
to take on board that type of persona of being very nonchalant or irreverent and not caring. So yeah, I think there's a very strong impulse there to be mean to look cool, very oddly.
I think there's a touch of Kingsley in that as well, though, maybe.
Yeah.
For what I've known. I mean, I can't remember the book. And I think Martin writes the forward to it or the introduction to it. And it's Kingsley Amis's book on English, on the English
Oh,
language,
the
I
King's
think.
English.
Yeah, the King's English, that's right. And he's a terrible, terrible snob in that.
Yeah.
The stuff he
The,
says is
I,
really rude,
I
like
think
to
there's a
people.
part. I think it's either in that book or it's around the same type of category where there's a moment where I can't remember if it was either Kingsley or Amos was reading something, but they're in the same room, and one points out to the other that there's a technical error because this person is referred to this wooden cabin as being dilapidated, and Kingsley says, "Well, that's incorrect because the word lapis in the word dilapidated is in Latin stone. So you'd only ever have a stone building would only be dilapidated, not that." And that was the world they functioned in. Was this everything's precise? Even though there's an excess of words, the words aren't wastefully incorrect.
No, no. I mean, I mean, it must have been fascinating, really.
Yes,
But then also, I suppose, could have been to some degree damaging as well,
yeah.
maybe. you know.
Well, it's that it's that thing as well where I think there's a description I think Christopher Hitchens gives of their original meeting from his memoir, where he talks about the fact that he perceived and the look of Martin at the time was very much in his early years of breaking out onto the scene. Is this the Mick Jagger look of of the literary world? This very pouty expression, somewhat good looking in an unusual way for somebody who's a writer, I suppose, because it's not exactly the most glamorous lifestyle, but they were there causing a fuss here, there, and everywhere, saying outlandish things. And yes, but it's troublesome. He arrived in a lot of trouble over his life, Martin, for things he had written and said.
So he gets into Oxford, and he actually graduates with a first, which is
with a Viva,
great.
as he describes it, which
A
is I think
Viva,
is
indeed.
which is I think he describes it as being the type of score or grade you receive where they invite you in and then compliment you on how much they enjoyed reading what you said. Not just
Yeah.
that it was very good, but it was a pleasure to read your work, which I think is also the autobiographical element that slips into the Rachel papers as well, where the character Charles Highway is obviously going into Oxford, is obviously going to do this, and he's.
Hmm.
I think there are scenes in there where he's put in his place by a tutor who says, you're going off on weird highbrow tangents that make no sense here whatsoever. You need to rein it in a bit.
Mm. And is it is his relationship with Kingsley, does it come out in any of his other works as far as you know? Because I don't remember, it's so long ago. I don't remember. I don't think there's much at all in terms of parental interaction in the
There's
Rachel
ve-
papers.
there's very little in the Rachel papers, and then throughout the rest of the work, I'd say the same. Actually, a lot of the characters are very solitary characters anyway, or if by a push they do have a family, they're re- self-removed almost from their immediate family anyway. So I
Hmm.
don't think it never feels like there's very much patriarchal
Hmm.
input from another character within the book. They're already well formed characters are already in the world they occupy. So I think the closest familiarly probably would be in something like The Information, where the main character is married,
Hmm.
but is obviously that's about again that's probably an autobiographical account of one writer trying to destroy another writer's career, and it's just not going right whatsoever.
Yeah. And as you mentioned, or as we've mentioned already, that he claimed to be influenced in his when he kind of discovers literature, as it were, by his stepmother, and particularly as she introduces him to Jane Austen. Is that seen anywhere in his works? Would you say?
Again, I don't think so. I don't see anything that would reference unless the character has something to do with literature.
Hmm. Hmm.
Outside of that, there's not much that goes in. It seems everything seems quite removed from the world of literature itself,
Hmm.
especially in the works of fiction, where even out of push, I think it said in the end of Money, John Self, the character in there, he imagined in an interview, he said like, "Where's John Self now? If the book finished and it was during the time when there was a BBC adaptation of the TV show with Nick Frost playing the titular character from the book,
Hmm. Hmm.
was saying like, where do you see him now?" I said, "Oh, maybe he's got a few slightly more long form magazines on a coffee table somewhere." And every
Hmm.
now and then he might think to open a book, but that's it. That's as far as it tends to go. So yeah, it's very interesting that I don't think there was a level of poverty to his life growing up because there was, but I imagine there was affluence when the times were good. The times were
Hmm.
good, and
Hmm.
then there were times when it just wasn't as good. But I don't think it ever seemed to be bad
Yeah, I
with his
mean,
early upbringing.
and this is probably unfair because I have no real basis of saying it unless I've been kind of subliminally can't even say it, influenced by 23 years ago, whatever, reading his memoir experience. But I do get the impression that it might have been in some ways a kind of perhaps neglect a little bit
Yeah,
in the way that very academic, very intelligent people tend to be, that they might actually not intentionally, but this kind of neglect of their offspring, as it
yeah.
were, a little bit.
It's very much a bohemian
Yeah.
aspect to their lifestyle, which makes sense if there are constant people to see, parties to go to, people to rub shoulders with, and things along those lines. And I don't
Yeah.
know if that necessarily translated into Martin later on in his own life with his own children. That seems. I know he has a daughter who he wasn't aware of for the longest time until she came out of the woodwork much later down the line.
Hmm.
But yeah, he seems to have unfavorably throughout. Just unfortunately for him, been given this. There's a yardstick already ahead of you in your life from the beginning, even from when you're a child, because I think there's always some expectation there that if you show any literary prowess and your parent is a literary or growing as a literary giant, then
Hmm.
there's going to be that thing there of the weight of expectation is just constantly upon you.
Yeah, it must be difficult, and having to, as you say, live up to that kind of thing as well, especially when you follow in that
Yeah,
parents' footsteps. Because I'm sure as you said earlier, maybe in the world of sport and things, but we know even from the world of sport there are a lot of sons who fail to
yeah,
massively fail to emulate their fathers. Maybe they're decent, if we take football for example, they're decent enough, they get to be professional, but they're playing in like League Three or something. I
yeah,
can't remember now all the leagues, whereas their dad played for Manchester United, for example.
yeah, yeah.
I guess I've seen it a bit, I suppose, in rugby. You can see that with I don't know if you follow rugby at all, but with like
I do
Owen
not.
Farrell, of course, his father was a fairly decent player, also played for England and stuff. So you can see it, and in literature, I don't know, I can't think of too many occasions where the son outshone the father
No,
to a
and
big
I
degree.
think usually the familial aspect would be siblings. It's like most famously
Yeah.
you would have there'd be the Bronte sisters and Branwell by extension, but even then, if you weighed it up, there's the most famous Bronte sister versus the secondary and third. Oh, I know it's
Mm,
personal taste involved as well, but it's usually like Jane Eyre would come to the foreground first to people instead of like the tenant of Wildfell Hall or something like that.
mm,
So
mm,
there are those aspects to it there where again I think it seems unfortunate that his own first book, though in my opinion a good one, maybe rose tinted glasses there because it was my initial exposure to it, doesn't. If we're doing a one book at a time, weight versus weight of father versus son, I think you'd be hard pressed to. I'd be hard pressed to put something necessarily maybe equal to Lucky Jim, but not greater than it.
mm,
Potentially, or even later on in life with the old Devils, which does win the Booker Prize. So that shows that there's this beginning of career, end of career. There's an award. There's an award, and it's quite a big award. And Martin was shortlisted, I think, for Times Arrow when it came out, and then longlisted for I think it was Yellow Dog. I think
mhm,
so, but he never made it that type of thing. But I think, given the amount of times their careers went, by that kind of time, you could almost think in Martin's mind, he'd be thinking, "I've got a good body of work behind me now to this point. At some point, I'm going to be under consideration for this award, and if I win it, I at least equal my father, and then." I don't know. I imagine the only remit he would have would be to say, have the people from the Nobel knock on his door and give him something that would allow him to fully just step out from it. But even then, he can never step out from anybody's autobiographical sentence around him or biography sentence around him of Martin Amis, very quickly followed in brackets, son of Kingsley Amis,
yeah,
will
yeah.
forever haunt him. So he can never appear in his own sentence. It seems without reference to his father, just there.
But I think that will probably decrease over time, and I guess to the there must be part of the thing that, like, maybe from a commercial point of view,
Mm,
uh, he's maybe more successful. I don't know. I don't know how wealthy Kingsley Amis was when he died,
mm,
but it's a long time ago. He died in
yeah,
1995, and I doubt he's read that much by anyone other than middle-aged people who read him 20 years ago, who
true.
are rereading him again.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah, there may not be, but there's an interestingness with that where I think Lucky Jim, especially being the book it is in things like the Penguin Essentials line as one of those classic British campus novel. In fairness, so it's set within it's like a subset type of genre, a campus novel, but still it's in the zeitgeist more so than anything else. Whereas I think apart from the occasional infamy of Martin Amis occurring now and then and his books
mm,
spiking or troughing in terms of popularity, I don't think, unless given the test of time, because obviously he only died incredibly recently,
mm,
given some longevity, I don't know if any of his books would make it into an equivalent publishing houses. This is our canon of classic modern literature that you should read. I feel like that in itself buys Kingsley a lot of time to constantly be something that newer generations will discover Lucky Jim, and then they might branch out into his other works and stuff like that. And like in my own personal aspiration, I have a personal interest in the Angry Young Men movement from Kingsley Amis, which was him, John Brain, and a few others, and Keith Waterhouse with Billy Elliot. And again, each of those authors seem to have one book that had a successful film, maybe had a sequel film, had a sequel to its own book, stage play adaptations were made of it, and stuff like that. And because of the excess of Amis's work, apart from Money, which has been done as a BBC adaptation and done quite well, I think it's very hard to capture Martin's work in any other medium. So if it doesn't live in the body of the canon outside of that, I think it will wane over time.
That's true, because they tried to film. They did film Rachel Papers, didn't they? And it wasn't.
It reminded me of like a slightly more lewd version of like Ferris Bueller's Day Off, basically. but it didn't necessarily work. They've adapted Night Train, even though that went under a different title. They adapted Dead Babies, which had Paul Bettany as the star of it. So his films have attracted adaptation and been well casted, but it always seems that, similar to his literature, it doesn't always land fully with the audience as he would probably expect it to. But then I know from criticism of, I think it was Yellow Dog was probably Martin's most critically panned book universally. Apart from saying, again, the thing of technically there's no sentence errors here as far as we can tell. All the punctuation and grammar is correct. But just nobody seemed to like it whatsoever. To the point of, I think it was a very harsh, and apologies readers, because this is a listener, should I say, because this is a little bit explicit. But I remember one critic said something like he was ashamed to read it on the tube in London for fear of somebody looking at you with the same look somebody would give having heard or seen that your uncle was flashing children at a primary school gate. So he claimed there was something weird, like being caught in a masturbatory instance of something very just crass. And it thought, like, even at your most dislike of something, I can still always appreciate the craft behind something. But I would never, very rarely do I ever read something and think that, have I ever gone to that type of length of disliking it? But then there was one quote I sourced from Goodreads, which was somebody said, "This is the worst book from one of the best novelists." So I think there is that element there of, not only is it very hit and miss for people, but when it's a miss, it can be a very large miss.
I think there's something similar a little bit there with, although I suppose he is a good, I don't know, maybe 15 years. Let's say he falls between Kingsley Amis and Martin, is J.G. Ballard, where he did write some really weird stuff. I personally think a great, author, and I really enjoyed a lot of his work. But then he produces something like Crash, for example, which is, weird. So I don't know if it's just something in the air during those days, as it were, that kind of era between the two.
I've not read much Ballard, but I know of Crash, and I know, like you say, in terms of, I know it for its weirdness. And I feel like if you're people might get into the rest of your body of work through that instance of weirdness. But I feel like that's probably the same angle with Martin as it will be, where he has throughout his career, especially in fiction, this very odd, and he's been criticized for it, an odd fixation with the Holocaust and with Nazi Germany and with the Gulag and that side of the USSR and the Eastern Bloc and things like that. And it seems to be a compulsion to tread where he probably shouldn't. Or he's criticized for not having necessarily the same right to tread there, which I think is an interesting angle, because in fairness, literature should be an open playing field for anybody to do anything and experiment anywhere. It's like with Time's Arrow, it deals with the concentration camps and horrific scenes due to the structure of the book being a time going backwards. The evil Nazi doctors are healing Jews and feeding them, and they're getting fatter and they're getting more prosperous as the book goes on. So there is this, you are put very uncomfortably a lot of the time into a circumstance. And for me, I've always thought, because of, outside of Kingsley, Martin's other avenues were Saul Bellow, who I've only read bits of, I've never read it in full books, but then also Nabokov sits as like another pillar. And it's hard to escape that same type of positional feeling of, say, Nabokov's Lolita, where you are put into this position where you are being tricked and you know you are being tricked, and it's uncomfortable to sympathize with somebody you know is a moral monster. And yet your heartstrings are being tugged. You almost feel like I could be friends with this person almost. And it's a very strange situation.
It's a tough read. It's a tough read, definitely.
But then there's like almost like a maxim from Nabokov, which is his thing was to chase his protagonists up a tree and then continue to throw stones at them. I think is the expression, is to just constantly give them a hard time and never let up with this torturous existence that occurs. And yeah, I feel like in those aspects of anything to do with Nazism or even the extremes of communism, there is this, you are put in a very odd place. And then like on the communist side of it, it led to a bit of a rift, not a rift. I would say it was a comedic spat in publications between Hitchens and Amis over Martin deciding, seemingly from left field, as far as I could tell, to decide to produce a non-fiction book called Cobra the Dread, dealing with Stalin and how things were in the gulags and stuff like that. It seemed provocative, deliberately provocative. It seemed like between him and Hitchens, there seems to be a lot of stance taking to say the thing you shouldn't say, to then almost baitingly look around at the rest of the room and ask, what are you going to do about it?
One-upmanship, see how far they could go. Yeah,
because another one of Martin's things was in one of his articles where he talked about there should be euthanasia booths on the corner of streets, and obviously the aging population, we should just do away with them and just and that's it. And you have to wonder why would you do that? And then there are things where, like his time in America when he's very young, he emigrates to America in later life anyway and leaves the UK, which is almost, as somebody who can't do right for doing wrong in the British media, he's seen as basically a traitor. You're leaving, you go to America, so can't win there either. But I think this connection to America led to the upset his remarks in later life caused following 9/11, because obviously he wrote a lengthy article called The Second Plane, and it's beautifully worded, talking about a tragedy again. But then again, it's not necessarily something that has anything to do with him. It's an American tragedy, even though he feels this connection to America. But he speaks very forthrightly on it, and then he has questionable to outright remarks regarding Islamophobia, where basically anybody who looks a certain way you should be suspicious of, and stuff like that. And even though those might genuinely been real feelings he was feeling in this very heightened time of awareness, and again, judging people by the way they look and stuff like that, which is ironic given his work thinking around the topic of concentration camps and the Gulag. So he's already written about what it's like to be somebody in a position who has been rounded up because of who they happen to be, an inalienable characteristic, and made them a position of sympathy within the story. But then outside of that, there's this weird liminal space where he can't seem to make that connection back to himself, that he's doing the exact same thing in the British press to a massive audience, because it's not that he's a crackpot to the side of whatever, just espousing some nonsense. It is that type of thing where anything he would say would make, maybe in itself, a headline or produce commentary thereon. So one of my favorite Guardian articles, which I go back to every now and then because it just tickles me, is Christopher Morris. If you remember him, he did Brass Eye and the Day to Day, and he did Four Lions recently. he wrote an article being critical of Martin Amis because he said in his research on Islam and terrorism, he just can't get away from Martin Amis and Christopher Hitchens constantly popping up, espousing nonsense and just muddying the water. So it's almost unfortunate, but then I've always been in a position of thinking, do you have to treat the art as a separate thing from the artist? Which is difficult to do in non-fiction, because that is just you saying, that is just your voice then. Even though it's still your voice within fiction, you at least have the setting and the context and the mise-en-scène or whatever it'd be, or if it's like Time's Arrow, you're doing it in a structured way, so there's like a, what's the term, to borrow another term from cinema, fabulate and sucé. So you're dealing with non-chronological storytelling, so there are gimmicks around it. But yeah, when you're outright just saying horrible things, like in your previous episode dealing with Lovecraft was very anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic, but then
Anti-everybody, to be fair, though.
anti everybody. And that might be the case for Martin Amis, really. But if you weren't in his crowd, you were on the outside.
But then you also mentioned earlier that there may have been some form of just persona or character that he created as well, which, maybe if you did meet him by off chance and you didn't let on that you knew who he was and you got chatting at a bar, he may well have been perfectly normal and pleasant.
That's it, because obviously a very close friend of his and that circle is Salman Rushdie, who obviously famously went into hiding for so many years because of the fatwa that was put upon him. So he's got that connection there to the same world again, where he's sympathetic with this person. But he's by default taking an against position because of the extremity of the fatwa. So there is that there. So he's not like, historically, he's not been on that side of not liking that monolith of religion in any sense. But then also, you just have to wonder if it's.
Well, I mean, he had a lot to say. He had a lot to say on agnosticism, and I mean that's no surprise again, seeing as he's friends with Christopher Hitchens, because we all know his book. Was it God is Not Great?
Yeah.
So I guess it's to do a lot with the company he kept. I guess we'll come back to that in a bit. It's funny when you mentioned, well, not funny, but you mentioned the euthanasia cubicles.
Yeah.
That for some reason I want to say that takes me back to Vonnegut, and I think it's Vonnegut, or it might have been Philip K. Dick, but I'm hoping it's Vonnegut because that fits in when you mentioned Vonnegut earlier. Was he wrote a short story where this is a feature? So it's kind of interesting that he said that.
I mean, it could be because, like I say, when I was looking at when the Rachel Papers was released and what was released at the same year, Breakfast of Champions is one of the books that's released in the same year. So you're in that market space. So even though across the pond, your contemporaries at that time are competing for the money in somebody's pocket against people like Kurt Vonnegut or whoever it might be.
And I was going to mention something else, but I think I've forgotten. So he, as we know, he finishes Oxford, he goes off, he gets a job at the TLS, Times Literary Supplement, and then on to become literary editor of the New Statesman, which of course is where he meets. He meets Hitchens there. That's right.
Yeah.
And he also writes features and things for the Observer.
Yeah.
We mentioned the Rachel Papers. During the 70s, early 80s, he publishes four books, something like that. Rachel Papers, Dead Baby.
It's a very because when I was trying to quantify it as well and breaking it down, so in the 70s he has 3 publications, and then in the 80s he has 7, the 90s he has 7, and then there's a slowing down in the noughties of 6. I'm not sure what the last decade is called. Is it called the tens? Are we in the tens when it's 2010 to 2019?
Tweenies, isn't it? The tweenies. Is that what they call it?
Tweenies. He has 5, and then obviously cut short at the moment with one of his, with his longest work, the Inside Story in the 20s. So there's a steady output of work, and I think looking at it, and then also looking at things like the number of pages per those books as well. It's interesting the format it takes where, like you say, he cuts his teeth in journalism with science fiction reviews. He then moves in those types of circles. As an aside, very fortunate to start your career at the Times Literary Supplement. I can only assume that might be the name carries some weight with it there and stuff like that.
Sure, it does. Sure, it
did. He's not starting at a local newspaper level and working his way up to something. So there is the silver spoon is constantly, instead of Damocles' sword above, there's the silver spoon dangling above. I think is the thing that cuts both ways. But yeah, so it's a few small novella-sized pieces of work to begin with, and then I don't own the other 2 collections because I think I knew this subconsciously, but I never delved into it. There were some short. Usually, you'd expect it to go maybe a novella or short stories, kind of simultaneously, but the short story collections seem to appear later on in his bibliography. And the volume of them, when you read it as a list of bibliography, looks to be quite a bit. However, there are duplications going on there with, which one is it now? So 2 stories is actually just a reprint, as is God's Dice. And those stories are taken from Einstein's Monsters and Heavy Water and other stories. So there is this aspect there of it appears that there's more to the body of work than there is, in fairness.
Mhm,
Those just got book treatments because it's Martin Amis. So, and again, he managed to sneak into something like, so in fairness, I will retract my previous statement about Lucky Jim being a Penguin Essentials, because God's Dice did make it into the Penguin 60s collection box set, where every anniversary Penguin release and at this rate, an ever-growing collection. You might see it over mirroring on the thing. The Penguin Little Black Classics at 80 collection there. I've got.
Oh, okay, yeah.
So he's made it into the 60s one. So he does have, I will give him that. Those short stories made it into a canon style body that will constantly be referred back to in Penguin's publication history.
Well,
But
actually, I mean, even I was just looking. Money itself was actually included in the Times's 100 best English language novels.
yeah.
So it's something I don't know. I'm guessing Lucky Jim may have been in there as well, but I'm
Yeah.
not sure. But so definitely the 80s and 90s are his most successful decades, biggest
Definitely.
output, and that kind of thing. And then in he has I guess the big thing, I suppose, that kind of must have been strange, having a larger than life father figure, I suppose. Kingsley Amis passes away in 1995. And do you see any change, any impact?
I don't believe that. If it's there, it's subtle, if not maybe in like a, what's the word for the bit at the beginning of books? Either the dedication,
Preface?
maybe, or if there's a preface or a dedication or something. Is it an epigram? Something like that that might be referential around there. But yeah, from that point on, you're dealing with the information preceded the death of his father, which is about rival authors. So that doesn't seem to be anything to do with it. Night Train is a murder mystery of sorts. Yellow Dog has a more surreal story to it. House of Meetings, he goes back to the Holocaust again. So nothing in the fiction seems to touch upon sudden fatherlessness.
But it does spur him into starting to write his memoir, though.
Yeah,
because I believe he starts it after the death of Kingsley, and then it's published, of course, in 2000.
Yeah, but even in that, it seems experience is very father centric and stuff like that. But again, to go back to like at the beginning, where you wouldn't believe this life if it was written down. He also talks about things with his cousin Lucy, who was abducted and went missing for a period of time, who it transpired was the victim of Fred West, who, for those that don't know, isn't I won't say famous, because I realize the term famous does an injustice to people who are horrible. He was
infamous,
an infamous serial killer through. I'm not sure what the timescale was there, but it crossed at least a decade, I suppose.
Oh, I think it was. I mean, was it Fred and Rosemary West? I think were probably killing from the 70s up to
So as far as he knows,
early 90s.
So you've got to imagine there's this whirlwind lifestyle that's happening. There's the disappearance of a relative completely, who then transpires to have been murdered in one of the worst ways you could imagine. It's not just a missing person who, I'm not saying this isn't terrible, but accidentally fell into a canal or something like that, and that's why they disappeared. So it was a very different circumstance again, where that just feels like tragedy has just happened. But then I'm not sure necessarily that presents itself in the stories necessarily.
No, I mean, the thing is, we wouldn't know, I suppose, because she went missing. I don't know. She was 20 something, wasn't she? She's quite.
Yeah.
So I mean, he probably didn't have a large enough body of work behind him.
Yeah.
For us to notice any effect that kind of loss, and also the fact he wouldn't have known, at least until when were the Wests discovered? Mid-90s, I think, if I remember right, because I remember obviously the news, and it was one of those things where we'd be like having it live, and then they found another one, because they were like digging up the garden and stuff. But so he's kind of again already established, so he wouldn't have known that she was dead, just disappeared, I suppose. Until he's well into adulthood. Lucy Partington, 21 years old she was when she went missing. So and then in the 2000s, Oh yeah, that's what I was going to say. I have remembered. And
Sorry,
it's funny when because he then because he gets married, of course, and also divorced and
yeah,
married and has a few other liaisons and things on the side. But his wife Isabel, is it Isabel
Isabel
Fonseca?
Fonseca. Yeah,
Um, that's probably a catalyst for him to actually move to America. I suppose. I think he spends some
yes,
time in Uruguay, which
yeah,
Fonseca has some link to,
yeah.
and then he moves off to America. And of course, that again, it's funny because that his great friend Hitch is also, I believe, living in America
At the same time, yeah, very
at the same
famously,
time.
very
So
famously, it was this thing of I don't know what it was about that. I don't know about a greater extended circle of friends, but obviously that is
mm,
there to be explored. That the idea almost even in later life, it seems, or much further down his life as an adult, is that the place to then be is in America because I don't know if it's down to Martin feeling that his time or what there is to explore within the English literary scene is done, but then also he's publicly better well received in America for being a literary icon, and he's not going to receive the same condemnations because there was obviously there have been a few. There was a publication scandal with the information where very famously he received a ridiculous sum up front of £500,000,
yes,
which rankled everybody, I think, and I think that news probably made its way throughout the entire publishing world, which was just there may have been larger sums of money, I imagine, exchanged hands with other authors of greater renown,
mm.
but those were probably didn't have scandal, the sound of scandal behind them, so we might not know about those. But yeah, that received a lot of trouble. He had a constant ongoing thing throughout his life with the quality of his teeth and having teeth issues that constantly made its way into the press. Any money he would spend on his teeth to try and correct the issue would also be commented upon. So again, he's kind of there are
But
ad hominem.
which press is that? The American press or
The British press,
the British? You
quite
see, that's funny because the Americans are always going on about the state
yeah.
of British people's teeth. So I would have
But
thought
then,
it was them. But
well, that might be part of why he wanted to have it corrected. But then
yeah,
also, I feel like that type of self improvement of getting your teeth corrected and fixed
mhm.
is received better in America because I feel like there's more acceptance there of surgery or things along those lines or whatever it
Yeah.
is. So I
Mm.
feel like that's to do there. But yeah, and then obviously when he's a little bit more down the road of being a senior novelist, there came around another comparatively low level scandal, but it got to that type of proportion where not far away from where I work, Manchester Metropolitan University hired him as a guest lecturer for a short period of time,
Mhm.
and it transpired that for the very, very small number of hours he was doing, the fee was astronomical, which obviously, rather than just them saying, and he was paid this much for the year, I think it was
Mhm.
£80,000 he got for the year. So, which if you're bringing in from your position, an A-lister, is
Mhm.
probably not worthy of commentary. But then
Mhm.
obviously other academic staff spoke unofficially saying that obviously this led to Martin Ames coming in receiving £3,000 an hour only for
Yeah.
so many hours of guest lecturing every now and then and fielding some Q&As with students here and there. So that just automatically I don't know if the case was that was somebody else of a similar stature
Mm.
within literature. I don't know if they would have been treated the same. I don't know if that would have happened to the same renown. But I think because being the bad boy in air quotes just carries with it this thing of whenever you do something that could be flipped or scrutinized is flipped and scrutinized into something else. Because as we all know, there are lecture circuits that go on all the time where people of renown or fame will tour places, give
Yeah.
speeches, whatever it might be, or get on a lecture circuit. It's not
I
an
mean,
unknown thing.
the only time I hear it spoken of in vitriolic terms is usually when it's a former prime minister.
Yeah, yeah,
When people hear that, Tony Blair earned, £3 million last year from the lecture circuit, people think,
yeah,
well, or especially, of course, now with Boris,
yeah,
people think, Jesus. But I think, I guess if it had been another field, if it had been a sporting field or
yeah,
a entertainment field, people don't bat an eyelid. But I think because academia is so famously poorly paid,
yeah,
that it gets people's backs up thinking that these universities who can't really afford to pay their staff a good
Can-
wage
can
have the
afford to be
money
mad.
to throw at authors to pop in 2 or 3 times a
Yeah.
year and do something. But he actually is also. I mean, you mentioned guest lecturing there, but he's lecturing in this in the States as well, is he? Or just
Yeah.
in
He does do some lecturing work over there, which you would expect, because outside of, if you're not producing furthering your body of work with more output, you're, apart from royalties, I imagine, you're not earning any money, because there's no advance from a new publication or whatever it might be. And yeah, especially with the scandal around the information, which for for listeners will appreciate this. If you are particularly obsessed might be the wrong word, but a little bit true for myself, with Martin Amis, and you collect a body of work from somebody, you also like it to look the same way. And I had collected the vintage collection of Martin Amis, and it all looked very nice and uniform. And then you get from, I think it's Flamingo, this ugly looking version of the information which does not blend in well whatsoever. So there is this thing. So even from myself, I am visually reminded that was Martin Amis betraying, from the outside point of view, betraying his publishing agent and going with this other person to receive an obscene amount of money. But then he needed an obscene amount of money for his life and to fix his teeth. So it all comes back to this ad hominem name calling where you have bad teeth and you can't help it.
I was just reading about it. Yeah, I mean, but he did. It's not that bad. Is that he ran postgraduate seminars, did 4 public events a year, plus a 2-week summer school.
Yeah.
Which for someone, I mean, it'd be like, if you were to get any. I mean, imagine if you were to try and get someone like Stephen King to do that. Of course, it's a different level, but it would cost you millions. So it's not too bad. But I do like what he said of it, though. I don't know if you'd seen the quotation where he says, "I may be acerbic in how I write, but I would find it very difficult to say cruel things to students in such a vulnerable position. I imagine I'll be surprisingly sweet and gentle with them." And he said that the experience might inspire him to write a new book, where he sardonically responds, "A campus novel written by an elderly novelist. That's what the world wants." So it's a pretty nice shout out, whatever you want to say to his dad there, I guess. But yeah. So yeah, I mean, it's he's an interesting guy. It's funny. I was looking at the pictures. They do look alike as well. I mean, you can see that it's definitely they're definitely related.
Yeah.
Dear. So we haven't touched too much on his personal life. We mentioned the fact he was married, divorced, married again, and he had 2 daughters. He had 2 sons, didn't he? And then 2 daughters.
He's got 2 sons, 2 daughters, and then I think he's got 5 children in total. So two from different formal relationships.
Yeah.
And then, as we mentioned, a daughter that appeared later on out of the woodwork of a liaison that he didn't know there was anything else to.
Yeah, back in 1976.
Parentally follow up on. But then, obviously, with some stuff as well, there is the element of, like in the non-fiction collection, visiting Mrs. Nabokov. There are these things where he's also, in his personal life, very much present in the lives of other literary giants of the time, with like Saul Bellow and Vladimir Nabokov and Philip Larkin. And I don't know if that's the influence of the age range of Kingsley, potentially, where even though there's no father figures in the work, so to speak, apart from until we get to Experience, he does seem drawn to father figures literarily elsewhere outside of his father, which is, I think, a very strange thing, because you'd think if he was going to seek that, and he wouldn't want to mirror the literary element of it, but it seems to be something he can't get away from. And then visiting in the art essay, visiting Mr. Nabokov, they lived in a hotel famously for quite a lot of years, and even after Vladimir Nabokov dies, his wife remains living there, and the essay is about him visiting her. And it's just interesting that he's got very personal connections outside, which don't seem to gel with the impersonal, like I say, acerbic persona publicly in the press and in the works. Nothing feels very personal in the works. Everything feels very removed of, even from the Rachel Papers onwards. It's a very solitary character, or in like which was it? I think it was Other People. Was one where the main female character in that just comes to you from a coma and is trying to explore her life and put it back together again. But there doesn't seem to be of a familial connection, or it's about something that's lost or trying to get back to. But you always start off in a very solitary place, but then outside of it, you get to peel back the layers and see he's actually quite sensitive to, from any other point of view, would be visiting an old lady who he doesn't have to visit anymore, but the gift of what Vladimir Nabokov did for him, he's reciprocating later on and still visiting and things like that. And I just think it's very interesting, that thing of, I think he has some personal effects of Saul Bellow because of the relationship that it was. I think he has Saul Bellow's leather jacket, I think is one of the things he has. So there are these very intimate connection points.
Well, I think I read somewhere in one of his books where he's critically slammed a little bit, and it's got something to do with Saul Bellow, I think. But his widow, Mrs. Bellow, comes to like defend him and stuff in writing and things. So yeah, I mean, it's very complicated, I guess, really, his relationships with all of these people. I
think maybe because his profile is as high as it is and his life's so public, that might be why there's not very much, or at least from my point of view. Obviously, I don't know about every aspect of his life and every facet, but it seems like that's why his work might be as impersonal as it is, because this is already treaded out everywhere constantly. Any wrong step is a misstep and will receive some type of coverage. Not even in the back of the newspaper. It's not like that's the thing. I think with Martin Amis, commentary around him wasn't just limited to the literary section of a newspaper. It would be an article about Martin Amis, and it would be treating him like he was a celebrity of any other type of stature, in like not in a gossipy way or like in the gossip pages, but it would be an article separate from the book section in a newspaper or a magazine. So he has transcended the literati circle in that sense. So that might be why his works don't ever go into such a personal thing, or it's very hedonistic and there's no feelings there necessarily all the time.
And is that one of his big attractions? Like for you, do you think that impersonal nature of it?
I think growing up, and like I said at the beginning, that outsider element, there is something to it. There is something very strange to it, and I can't speak to. I won't presume to speak to a female audience and how they would interpret it differently. But there are things to that where you do feel like there's a very high and flashy, impersonal element to life, and it's weirdly alluring. And you can't, like you're saying with J.G. Ballard and Crash, there's this weird, alluring oddness that you shouldn't be drawn to this flame, but you just find yourself in playing the role of Moth, and you can't help it. And it's like if it's reading Bret Easton Ellis in American Psycho, whatever it is, you get the very stylistically very similar type of style over substance potentially, but there's something about that flashiness that draws you in or whatever it is. And there are people as well that have, I wouldn't say followed in Martin Amis's footsteps, but the parallels either found or presumed to be there could exist, because I know there's a motif around the idea that people like Will Self and his body of work is kind of the unofficial progeny that's following in the footsteps of Martin Amis would be Will Self, or I've seen it also said of Zadie Smith, who kind of falls in that similar category as well, where there's very, for one, kind of London-centric and also style, hyper maximalist style is very much in the style of Martin Amis, and they're kind of like torch bearing that further forward. And I know they're very hit and miss as well with certain audiences and stuff like that. And it's not just there's critical acclaim there and there's well received, but there's a chalk and cheese element there that can't necessarily be escaped.
And would you say your experience of him has changed over time? Like when you've gone back to maybe reread something like the Rachel Papers, do you get the same out of it as you got when you were?
I get out of it now the nostalgia of going, I remember me then reading that.
Okay.
thinking this is where it's at. God, this is cool and stuff like that. And which I imagine you might do if like myself, if you were ever an introspective teenager, and all of a sudden you're presented with somebody you can fully escape into, and they are flashy and daring, very full of themselves and very sure of themselves, and just they're going to go for it, and they're cleverer than everybody else. They don't necessarily. That was the thing as well with like Charles Hyre in the Rachel Papers. He's not a looker. He described himself as being very interesting looking, but he's not leading man material in the strictest sense of having that look.
Well, it's supposedly semi-autobiographical, isn't it? So
yeah, which
maybe he had bad teeth.
Yeah, which again comes into like the aspect of the Pregnant Widow, which I think the Pregnant Widow is a Saul Bellow reference. I think, unless I'm misremembering that title is a nod to, it's either Bellow or Nabokov. I can't remember who used it as an expression of a generational thing of like it's a pregnant widow, and that is very autobiographical in the sense that you get that I can actually picture Martin Amis being that young in a chalet somewhere. There's a pool. There are beautiful people around you. You all could care less about anything whatsoever, because the cool thing is to just roll your own cigarettes, casually read highbrow literature, sneer at everybody else, and just it was very much that type of. You felt like the 80s answer to, say, Ernest Hemingway in like A Movable Feast, where there's this thing of there's a lifestyle to it as well that is almost tenable, I would say, but then removed because you can't quite get there because it's kind of a time that's lost and past, and it's
trying to recapture that kind of writers' cliques or whatever, whereas you say from past times. Now, you mentioned cigarettes, and of course, unfortunately, it was his undoing.
Same as Best Friend.
Same as the Hitch. Yeah. Exactly. It's crazy, and the same. Yeah, the same disease. So, we sadly lost Martin Amis May this year, 2023, 19th of May, 2023, and just. As we mentioned at the beginning, he was, of course, knighted, backdated to the day before his death. So, of course, even in that way, he receives, although he didn't know it, at least recognition-wise, the same status as his father, which I guess is something. It's just a shame he didn't know about it, I suppose. Well, he may have known about it, actually.
Yeah,
because
there might have been some forward
the honours list goes out to them beforehand, and I'm assuming it's the June honors list. So if he died in May, he would have known. So just before we finish, Will, I would like you to give us, I don't know, 2 or 3 of first off, give me off the top of your head your favorite, if you can. If you could only take 1 or possibly 2 of his works, what would they be?
This is my Desert Island Discs moment, is it?
Kind of, yeah. And I mean, your favorite. Don't worry about like recommendations. But your favorite.
That is very tricky. I feel the information, even though it carries a scandal with it, the information is a fantastic story of pettiness taken to extremes. It's fantastic for that element. And then probably to go the opposite way away from the fiction would probably be I'm going to forget the complete title now. So I look over my shoulder. The War Against Cliché, probably, just because it's the essays that are there. But then also, I'd recommend, because we didn't touch upon this, and it's such an odd, from my point of view, it's such an odd book. It's such an odd book. Is that I personally missed the original run of most of the Martin Amis body of work. So I've had to acquire reprints because I have limited funds and can't afford to go out of it. But Invasion of the Space Invaders is his non-fiction book about arcades and gaming. It has a very strange introduction by Steven Spielberg, where he kind of talks weirdly about Martin Amis as somebody he seems to pretend to be aware of, but it obviously transpires he has no idea who it is. But for me, it was such an unusual book that it's worth just because it's so far removed from Amis doing his stint at the Times literary supplement, or where at the newspaper of writing science fiction reviews or reviewing the works of peers. It feels like an assignment that was given to him, and it's this very odd mode of somebody who doesn't seem like they're interested in the idea of, because electronics kicking in arcades in the 80s, very much like a stylized thing, But
Mhm.
obviously now it feels like just a time capsule of 8-bit cartridge games and things like that. It's just so if I can be cheeky and go to a third one, that's the third one I put
Yeah,
in there because it's
yeah, of
just
course you can.
so bizarre and out of left field for what you'd view as the body of work that you almost have to take special attention to go there and just bask in it for a second because it's so odd.
But I'm guessing none of those three would be your recommendations to start with Martin Amis if you've never
No,
read him before.
to start with Martin Amis, I would start with Night Train for its slimness and because
Mhm.
it's a slightly unusual murder mystery, but just a good way into his style to see
Mhm.
if you like it. And it's almost of a genre where the hyper stylized nature isn't there necessarily. It feels a bit more restrained in some sense. But then out of that, you kind of have to go towards the bigger books, I think, to get the next flavor of it. And I probably would say Money would be a very good one. It's kind of loosely put into a category of a trilogy with London Fields and the Information, but that's just a very loose. There's nothing linking them as a trilogy per se.
Yeah.
But it would probably be Money, and then to my shame, there are a couple of books I've not actually acquired yet or read yet. So my own time with Martin hasn't finished, even though he's now passed. So I still feel like I almost don't want to read those because that would put some finality to it.
Yeah, I
And then
understand that.
I've done everything. So if I leave them there as a lingering thing to get around to, my journey with Martin won't be finished. So even rereads, there'll be some strange feeling to have, which would be, oh, I've read the last word now,
Yeah.
and I'm up to date, and I feel like that would be something I almost don't want to do. So personally, I can't recommend Inside Story because I haven't read it, and I may never read it, even though I love Martin Amis. I may just never read it because it's so autobiographical, and it happened at the end of his life. It feels like I'd be in some space that would be very odd as a reader. So yeah, that might be different for other people who a deceased writer might have been dead a very long time, so you've got no choice but to
Mm,
leave,
mm,
explore some avenues. But everything feels very fresh at the moment still. And
yeah.
I'm not somebody who's got like a celebrity thing where it's like when you see people who were back in the day screaming and passing out because of the Beatles or whatever it might be. I don't have that level of fandom, but I did feel very personally sad to think like, oh, I had things to look forward to, and now there's this life got in the way a little bit and made it a bit sad.
There might be some things still to come out, though. I mean, a lot of
Yeah,
writers do leave things in their papers lying around, and there may have
yeah.
been something sitting in a publishing house waiting to come out. So,
I
you know,
can't imagine. I also can't imagine that posthumously there's not going to be the letters or diaries.
letters exactly. Yeah,
So I can't picture it being the end of the publication journey for the output of Martin Amis. But
I do wonder when we're going to get to that stage where it's not going to be authors' letters anymore. It's going to be
no,
authors' emails.
or WhatsApp messages.
Yeah, yeah, the complete Snapchats of
Yeah,
Well, of course, they disappear. I think someone told
yeah.
me. I don't really know it, but
I
that wouldn't be
don't know
much
either.
good. So, yeah. Well, Will, thank you so much. It was really great fun. Thank you, really,
Thank you
ever
for
so
having
much
me.
for coming on and talking about Martin Amis.
Thank you for having me on. Thank you.
Once again, I would like to thank Will ever so much for joining me for that very interesting chat, and I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. Please do check out his YouTube channel. All relevant links and things will be in the description below. Thanks again for joining us. Do take care, everybody. Until next time, all the best. Bye-bye.